Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. I am here in the reading room, and we are reading A Different Mirror for Young People. So again, this is an adaptation. It looks like, well, it is an adaptation of what would probably seem to be a much darker version of this book. And I happen to like the educational value of it, and I think that this book is great for educators, for sure. And starting good topics of conversation, as you know, provided that you're able to keep those topics under control. And they're only under control when people feel that justices have been addressed as best that they can be, knowing that history is history, but it does seem like it can repeat itself, doesn't it? With opportunities time and time again. Okay, so Dr. Annette Feravich, ready and rolling. This is day 241. It is September 3rd and a beautiful Michigan day. Still seems like summer outside. Chapter 13, Blacks arrive in northern cities. Mexicans trekking to El Norte were not the only people who migrated northward in the early 20th century. Southern blacks were moving by the tens of thousands to the cities of the Northeast and the Midwest. The spirit behind this migration was later described by Zora Neale Hurston, an African-American writer who was a sharecropper's daughter. And black men's feet learned roads. Some said goodbye cheerfully, others fearfully, with terrors of unknown dangers in their mouths. Others, in their eagerness for distance, said nothing. The daybreak found them gone. The wind said north, trains said north, the tides and tongues said north, and men moved like the great herds before the glaciers. That's really poetic. Oh, and here we are. Sorry for the, I should have been reading and holding this up. Here is the Renaissance Casino Ballroom in Harlem, New York City, 1927. You know, I've been thinking a lot about how things could get redistributed. And even though there's, you know, you got to watch about races and what races want to do what, and what races might not want to do some things, right? I don't know, I think Mexicans are doing a pretty good job handling our agriculture as long as they don't have people who are regulating involved who just want money from people who really do take, it seems to me, there's a lot of farmers who take a lot of pride in what they do. And getting this farmer's welfare does not do anything for the pride of the farmers. But I have had to think about blacks. And, you know, you can't just give them a chunk of the music industry, like rap. And would you give them a chunk? That would be the chunk that you would give them arts and entertainment. I would say arts and entertainment, you know, that's fun. That's fun in a sexy but clean way, right? Where you are getting couples together and they were enjoying nightlife in a safe environment. I just think that arts and entertainment is what I think. And, you know, that goes for movies too. I would think that just kind of integrity in the arts, you know, crosses over races, but there are certain, you know, lendings that we have, it seems, historically. And we do. In just 10 years, from 1910 to 1920, the black population jumped from 5,700 to 40,800 in Detroit, from 8,400 to 34,400 in Cleveland, from 44,000 to 109,400 in Chicago, and from 91,700 to 152,400 in New York. The African Americans who made this journey were both pushed from the south and pulled from the north. Pushed and pulled. Like the immigrants from Asia, Mexico, and Europe, Southern blacks were driven from their homes by economic and social forces. After the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of the slaves, most blacks in the South had been forced to become sharecroppers and tenant farmers. They were dependent on white landowners and enslaved all over again, this time by debt. The ordeal of sharecropping was crushing. After months of labor at the end of the harvest season, tenant farmers were often disappointed to find themselves deeper in debt. They were politically free but in economic bondage, with no hope of getting ahead and owning their own land. Where I come from, folks work hard all their lives until they die and never own no part of earth nor sky. Meanwhile, they were pulled to the north. World War I, which had begun in Europe in 1914, had cut off the flow of European immigrants into the United States. And here's the thing. Now you've got all these immigrants with no place to go. They were born here, by the way, folks. Most of them are born here. Now what are we going to do with this? Well, you know, there is a war brewing. I can hear the bugle call now. So World War I, which had begun in Europe in 1914, had cut off the flow of European immigrants into the United States. This created tremendous labor shortages in the nation's industries. Factories, mills, and workshops that had once refused to hire black workers now sent labor recruiters to the South to sign them up. Southern blacks jumped at this opportunity. Whole trainloads of them set out for the North, drawn by the offer of better work and better wages. One black worker told a reporter, "The best wages I could make in Georgia was $1.25 or $1.50 a day. I went to work at a dye house in Newark, New Jersey at $2.75 a day with the rent-free room to live in. The company paid my fare north." Like Mexican immigrants, African Americans were following the jobs. Those who went north sent home glowing reports about work. A South Carolina newspaper described the good fortune of a young man from a Greenwood County farm who had gone north to work for $25 a week. He came home last week to assist his people on the farm and brought more than $100 and plenty of nice clothes. He gave his mother $50 and put $50 in the Greenwood Bank and had some pocket change left. But something more was happening among the blacks in the South, something that went deeper than economics. The generation that had been freed from slavery was dying out, and so were the habits that slavery had bred into the generation. Habits giving way to whites of accepting their place in society. Southern whites lamented that the humble, polite, and courteous blacks they had known were disappearing. In their place, a new generation of blacks was rising. The new generation. In place of the old-time former slaves, the South now had younger African Americans who had been born after the Civil War and had never known slavery. Unlike the older generation, this new generation did not feel the lingering power of the master-slave relationship. Whites complained that younger blacks were discontented and wanted to be roaming. They wanted to see something of the world. Most of the blacks who moved north belonged to the generation that arose after the Civil War. In addition, the higher wages they expected to earn in the North, these African Americans also hoped to escape the racial violence and prejudice of the South to find a place where they could claim some dignity. A black-owned newspaper called the Chicago Defender spelled out the need. A Chicago newspaper called a black-owned newspaper called the Chicago Defender spelled out the need for African Americans to come north for the sake of their safety and self-respect. Why stay in the South where your mother, sister, and daughter are raped and burned at the stake, where your father, brothers, and South are treated with contempt and hung to a pole riddled with bullets at the least mention that he does not like the way he is treated? Freed from the shadow of slavery, young blacks could imagine new possibilities for themselves in the North. By 1930, about 2 million of them had migrated to the cities of the North. Their freedom had been given to them by the North in the Civil War, but their migration was their own choice. African American Chicago. Chicago was a major destination of the African American blacks. The fast-growing industries of this Midwestern city were creating jobs and actively inviting blacks to fill them. It was easy for Southern blacks to get to Chicago too. The Illinois Central Railroad connected the city to the small towns of Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. In 1900, Chicago's black population numbered 30,000. 20 years later, it had jumped to 109,000, concentrated in the mostly black neighborhoods of the city's south side. This rapid increase in the black population sparked an explosion of white resistance. White citizens formed organizations to pressure real estate agents not to sell houses to blacks. They also urged white property owners not to sell or rent to blacks. A leader of this movement declared, the districts which are now white must remain white. There will be no compromise. The conflict over housing increased during World War I as blacks flocked to fill jobs in Chicago's war-related industries. In 1917, the Chicago Real Estate Board announced that Southern blacks were pouring into Chicago at the rate of 10,000 a month. Workplaces also became racial battlegrounds. In 1910, about half of all working blacks were employed in service jobs: servants, laundresses, janitors, and waiters. The war created a sharp demand for labor and opened new opportunities in industry. By 1920, the majority of black men and 15% of black women worked at factory jobs rather than service jobs. For the first time in their lives, these young African American men and women were working in industries and making what they considered good wages. Managers deliberately hired black workers to undermine the union activities of white workers. Company owners hired a black man named Richard Parker to set up a black union, the American Unity Labor Union. Although Parker appeared to be working to promote African American interests, in reality, he was paid by the white business owners to pit black workers against whites so that blacks would not join the white union. It was old strategy of divide and control again. By keeping black and white workers from uniting, management kept both groups from reaching their full strength. Parker urged black workers not to trust the whites and to sign up only with the black union. The strategy worked. When a white union called the Stockyard Labor Council opened the door to black members, its offer was rejected. Racial tension in the workplace added fuel to conflicts in the neighborhoods. In 1917, the homes of several black families were bombed. White gangs attacked blacks in the streets and parks, murdering several men. Race hatred exploded into a riot after a young black man drowned when he floated into the whites-only section of a public beach. Frustrated because the police made no arrest, blacks attacked whites. White gangs then began beating blacks, and violence between the races raged for days. By the time the rioting ended, 23 blacks and 15 whites were dead, and 342 blacks and 178 whites were injured. African Americans in Chicago responded to racism by depending on themselves. Black ministers and community leaders called for people to start their own shops, banks, and insurance companies. Blacks, they said, should rent from other blacks and spend their dollars on goods made and sold by African Americans. Black pride in Harlem. The other major destination of the African American migrants was New York City, home of Harlem, a neighborhood that was sometimes called the Negro capital of the world. Blacks had lived in Harlem since the 17th century, when they were the slaves of Dutch colonists in North America. In 1790, not long after the United States won its independence, a third of Harlem's population was black. Over the years, though, the African American presence there grew smaller. By 1890, Harlem was a wealthy, mostly white neighborhood, and then the black migration from the South changed it again. Just as the migration started, a housing boom in Harlem collapsed, leaving a large number of apartments empty. Black real estate agents leased these apartments from the white landlords and then rented them to black tenants at a profit. In this way, Harlem began to become a black neighborhood again, in spite of residents who tried to keep African Americans out, just as they had done in Chicago. Oopsie. And again in the 70s, right? I mean, we left Chicago because the same ideas were brewing. In 1914, about 50,000 blacks lived in Harlem. During the 1920s, more than 118,000 whites left the neighborhood and more than 87,000 blacks moved in. Harlem had become the home of more than 2/3 of all African Americans who lived in Manhattan. Soon, however, Harlem was overcrowded. Living conditions grew worse as landlords neglected the upkeep of their properties. Remember, the landlords were the whites, then leasing them to the blacks to rent out. So the blacks were the middleman. Tenants complained about broken pipes, leaking roofs, and rats. Yet discrimination made it difficult for blacks to move to other parts of the city, so they were forced to remain in Harlem, paying higher and higher rents. High rents were a burden to African American tenants because most of them worked in low-paying menial or service jobs. Some black women worked in the garment industry, but the majority was employed as domestic servants. Some men were longshoremen or teamsters, but many were janitors, elevator operators, and waiters. Despite crowded living conditions and poor wages, African Americans in Harlem felt a surge of power and a sense of pride. They were inspired to create community that became more than just a place to live. To black intellectuals, Harlem became what poet Langston Hughes called the center of the new Negro Renaissance. It seems the cops couldn't let these areas naturally flourish. Who broke up the community? That was my question there. That's what I have written right here. This says the Renaissance Casino Ballroom in Harlem, New York City. So this is a further out view of the close-up that we saw on the first page of this chapter. So there's the close-up. And then there is the shot further away. Really pretty cool. Black poets like Hughes, novelists like Jean Tremere, painters like Jacob Lawrence, and musicians like Cab Calloway were attracted to Harlem, a community that reflected a vision of black pride and creativity, drawing their inspiration from black people's lives history, and culture, Harlem's black intellectuals created a literature that rebelled against mainstream, white-dominated middle-class America. Part of the new Negro movement was the search for identity that Hughes revealed in his poetry. He asked whether he belonged to Africa or to Chicago and Kansas City and Broadway and Harlem. Like other African Americans, he was struggling to create a sense of himself that was both African and American. The Great Depression. By the late 1920s, Harlem had become a slum, the home of poor people desperately clinging to dreams. The Harlem Renaissance, so people praying for a change. And we will uplift our spirits to change this, and again, suppressed. The Harlem Renaissance, with its cabarets, its swinging jazz, and its literary successes, hid much of the ghetto's squalor. Then came the stock market crash of 1929, followed by the Great Depression that lingered for most of a decade. The shattering of the economy revealed the grim reality behind the glamorous image of Harlem. African Americans everywhere fell into deeper poverty. Despite the Great Migration to the North, most American blacks still lived in the South in the 1930s, growing cotton as tenant farmers and sharecroppers for white farmers. Their livelihoods crumbled along with the stock market. When blacks moved to cities in search of work, they were met by angry, out-of-work whites shouting against the hiring of African Americans. By 1932, more than half of all blacks in southern cities were unemployed. The unemployment rate for blacks in northern cities was similar. Black employees were the first to be fired when times got tough. One study found that the population of unemployed blacks was 30 to 60% greater than that of whites. Think that the whites were better workers, and that's what it accounts for. Many desperate families unable to afford apartments or groceries lived in cellars and foraged in garbage cans for food. Federal aid programs for people in distress forced African Americans to take a back seat when white farmers and workers received higher rates of support than blacks. White farmers and workers received higher rates of support than blacks. This crisis led to debate among black Americans about their future. W.E.B. Du Bois, the nation's leading black historian and scholar and leader in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, had long pushed for integration and end to racial separation. During the hardship of the Great Depression, however, he suggested that African Americans should practice voluntary temporary segregation, banding together and helping one another, doing business only with one another, forming a black nation within the United States. The NAACP harshly criticized this idea, calling instead for a movement that would unite all labor, white and black, skilled and unskilled, agricultural and industrial. Blacks had indeed begun to enter industrial employment and the big national labor unions. In 1933, the United Mine Workers led a campaign to bring black workers into the union, and the Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO, soon did the same. In the auto industry, the United Auto Workers urged blacks to join, pledging that the union was against racial discrimination. These achievements did not mean the end of racism among the white workers, but they showed that solidarity across racial lines was essential for workers who were struggling against management in a time of economic crisis. Meanwhile, Democratic politicians recognized the size and potential power of the black vote. They began addressing the needs of blacks. In response, blacks started to abandon the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, who had freed the slaves, in favor of the Democratic Party. Black Americans were becoming politically important, but their advances in labor and politics were soon swept up, along with much else, in the international currents of World War II. Well, what were they there for in El Norte anyway? Here is the story, the personal story. The ambitious architect of Black pride. If one person embodied the vision of Black pride that swept through Harlem like a fresh wind, it was Marcus Garvey. Up, you mighty race, he declared to Blacks in America. You can accomplish what you will. This is the documentary I saw. So it just so happened it came on. And so this is the man from Harlem I was talking about. I knew that they were going to get to it because it was a right era. So let's hear about Marcus Garvey. And there's a documentary out there on him too. It was really good. But let's see. Born on the Caribbean island of Jamaica, Garvey experienced a childhood free of racial awareness. To me at home in my early days, there was no difference between white and black, he later wrote. Garvey and a white friend played together without thinking about their skin color until Garvey was 14 when his friend's parents separated them because of Garvey's race. It was then, Garvey wrote, that I found for the first time that there was some difference in humanity and that there were different races, each having its own separate and distinct social life. A few years later, Garvey traveled to Europe, where he began to develop ideas about Black nationalism, a sense of devotion to Black culture, along with the belief that Blacks should express unity, pride, and power. In 1914, he returned to Jamaica and founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, to promote Black nationalism with the goal of uniting the Black people of the world and establishing an African American nation in Africa. Garvey's message was that Black skin is beautiful, that Africa had a glorious past, and that Blacks were destined to rule Africa. If Europe is for the Europeans, then Africa shall be for the Black peoples of the world, he wrote. The other races have countries of their own, and it is time for the 400 million Negroes to claim Africa for themselves. Very interesting, isn't it? In particular, he's Jamaican. In 1916, Garvey made Harlem the base of his movement. The UNIA exploded with activity. Colorful parades, publications, the establishment of Black-owned small businesses such as groceries and laundries, and even the founding of a shipping company called the Black Star Line, in which African Americans could invest. The Black Star Line was the biggest symbol of the UNIA, but it was badly managed and ran into debt. In 1922, Garvey was charged with defrauding investors. No, this was not the same Garvey, sorry. In Harlem, there was a congressional representative that does seem to have come from an island, if I remembered, because I was kind of surprised. I was like, oh, he was a member of Congress. He wasn't the president. Garvey was charged with defrauding investors, even though the government's case was weak and there was no proof that Garvey had intended to commit fraud. Sentenced to 5 years in prison, Garvey was pardoned after 2 and deported to Jamaica. But although Garvey was gone, the powerful dreams he represented remained alive in the hearts of the people of Harlem and Blacks everywhere. By strengthening their sense of racial pride, he had forever changed the way Black people looked at themselves. The spokesman, an African American publication, declared Garvey made thousands think who had never thought before. Thousands who merely dreamed dreams now see visions. And it is so interesting about all of the same themes, one of them being keep the educational level at the 6th grade, 7th grade level. But, you know, those people are hungry learners, and information really is just intoxicating. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. That was chapter 13. I will be back here for chapter 14 to read chapter 14 of this great book, A Different Mirror by Ronald Takaki and adapted by Rebecca Steffoff. We are here on completing day 241 in the classroom. It is September 3rd. I will see you tomorrow. It is my cousin's birthday tomorrow. I just don't ever forget it. It's so weird. Pinky, tomorrow's your birthday. Happy birthday if I forget to say it on air. All right, so thank you so much for joining me here in the classroom, day 241, where we really are getting different perspectives in what we read and how we educate ourselves, see the Bookless classroom, in order to get our minds, our bodies, and our spirits healthy, healthy, healthy. Thanks for joining me.